If you're looking for a lens that is going to help elevate your work, that's actually affordable and is flexible enough to use on just about any camera body, then look no further than the Contax Zeiss 25mm f2.8. This is a vintage lens that I've owned for a little over a year, and it's quickly become one of my all-time favorites. I brought it on a couple of documentary shoots that I've done over the past year and have been able to use it on multiple different cameras, including my Red Komodo and my Sonys. And in today's video, I want to talk about my experience with the lens and basically just gush about it and tell you why I think that this lens, even in today's day and age with all the good lens options out there, is really in a class of its own. I'll look at what I like and what I don't like, of course, but yeah, it's a lens that I've been super happy with and is one that I can't recommend enough. All right, let's get into it. For those of you that are new around here, my name is Riley and I'm a documentary filmmaker who's produced films on multiple continents around the world using the gear that I talk about on this channel. So if you're into documentaries or making films with small crews, then you're in the right place. Consider subscribing and following along. All right, back to the video. When it comes to character, this is obviously something that is a little bit subjective when it comes to lenses, but the way that I would describe the character of this lens specifically is it's subtle but fantastic. I think that the lens overall is very sharp. It has kind of really beautiful color renditions, and there isn't really any like obvious flaws with the lens, but it does have enough subtle character to help kind of set it apart. The lens is sharp and detailed as you would come to expect from a Zeiss lens, and the bokeh is also very soft and pleasing. I think that it definitely has kind of a vintage feel in that it's definitely different from most modern lenses, but it doesn't have sort of that kind of overly clean and overly sterile look that you might get in a lot of today's lenses that are trying to be really clean and flawless. The lens also has really good color representation in a way that I think is really pleasing and is easy to use in a lot of different situations. The lens also has really good highlight reproduction and kind of adds to a good highlight roll-off. Another thing that I like about this lens is just how well it's built. It is pretty compact, but it's definitely like heavy for the size, not in a bad way, but just in a way that makes it feel very well built. The focus throw on this thing is just about right in that it's not so far that you can't do it by hand, but it's also not so short that you're gonna have a hard time kind of getting focus in a precise way. One thing that's sort of obvious, but I think is worth pointing out and dissecting a little bit, is the fact that this is a fully manual lens. It's obviously a vintage lens, and so it's not going to have any sort of electronic communication with the camera. And you probably have guessed that there's no autofocus, you're not going to be able to change the iris and that sort of thing. But I think that the more important thing that this creates with not being able to talk to the camera is there aren't any built-in lens corrections that the camera is going to do on behalf of the lens. So any sort of like very subtle imperfections that are going to add to the character of the lens are not going to get corrected out in like an artificial or computational way. One of the really nice things that cameras do often these days is apply lens corrections, and it makes lenses cheaper and smaller and lighter, but it sort of removes some of these like subtle characteristics that make lenses really interesting because it's trying to give like a perfect, flawless image. And while I don't think this lens has any obvious flaws, those very, very subtle imperfections I think create a pleasing and kind of beautiful characteristic that I really appreciate on this lens, especially when you pair it with the fact that it is sharp, has good colors. So I guess if I was gonna have sort of a hot take when it comes to the clinicalness that kind of gets complained about with modern lenses today, I think it's a result of this sort of thing that's happening with modern tech, is that cameras are correcting for imperfections in lenses and are trying to give us a very clean, neutral, flawless image. And because a lot of these corrections are sort of reproducing essentially the same thing that's labeled as like clean or a good looking image. The vignette is totally corrected out, the distortions are totally corrected out, any sort of sharpness or chromatic aberrations like are getting adjusted or corrected out in camera. And when you kind of add all of these things together and the impact that that's going to have on the bokeh and the way that, you know, light is going to hit the lens and create interesting sort of flares or, you know, light leaks and that sort of thing, when all of that gets sort of washed out, you're going to have like a clinical look that people kind of can often complain about. But when you have fully manual lenses like this that aren't talking to the camera, you're not going to have those things sort of like washed out and given like the sort of clean standard look that the camera is trying to recreate with just about every single lens. And so you're going to get the very subtle characteristics. It's a characteristic that I think is definitely clean enough to be able to use on corporate stuff, but I think it's going to give you just enough of a subtle difference that it's going to kind of help elevate your work beyond sort of the standard modern stills lenses. When I purchased this lens a little over a year ago, it was right around $300. And so I think that if you can find a copy that's in good condition for somewhere around that $250 to $400, you're gonna have a really affordable prime lens that's gonna have some pretty good characteristics and is also gonna be flexible enough to kind of live with you long term over multiple camera bodies. This lens comes in a CY mount, and it's just an old vintage mount that I've adapted to EF with this little adapter ring. And so any camera that can accept an EF adapter, like a Sony or Canon or Red or Nikon or pretty much any mirrorless camera these days, is gonna have some sort of adapter that's gonna accept EF lenses. You can use this guy on it. And that also is gonna mean that cameras like the FX30 or the Red Komodo, you could use a speed booster with this guy. And honestly, any camera, you could use a rear mounted ND filter with the lens and have a ND filter that you don't need to screw on the front of the lens. But because the lens is so well built, it can easily accept filters and a lightweight matte box if you needed one as well. I really don't have any kind of crazy or obvious complaints when it comes to this thing. I think that, you know, as a prime lens, like I wish it was an f2, but I also am totally fine with an f2.8. I think it has a good amount of character, sort of subtle, nuanced way, like I've talked about, that at an f2.8, it's totally fine. And, you know, I can use a speed booster with this thing on my Red Komodo or my Sony FX30, and then you get about like an 18 or so f2 lens, which I think does get to be pretty fast and pretty reasonable to use. There's a reason why these lenses have stood the test of time. Not only is their image quality fantastic, but if you can find a copy that was well taken care of, then it's something that probably is gonna last you a while as well. So overall, I've been super happy with this lens, and it's one that I can't recommend it enough. I think that there is a ton of value when it comes to sort of the price to quality ratio. I think this lens is one that is well built, is gonna last me a long time across multiple camera bodies, and is just something that I can rely on to get a really good image that is gonna have just a slightly different, slightly more sort of romantic, different kind of feel to it than some of my modern stills lenses.